Episode 55, January 1915. My 4 years in a Frenchwoman's cupboard, by Trooper Patrick Fowler, read by Jerry White. This astounding story of how an intensely brave and resourceful Frenchwoman, sheltered from January 1915 to November 1918, a British soldier who had been cut off from his regiment at Cateau and wandered for 4 months, is told by the soldier himself, Trooper Patrick Fowler, late of the 11th Hussars. Fowler spent many weary hours hidden in a cupboard with German soldiers billeted in the same room. Over and over again, he owed his life to the quick wit of Mme Belmont-Gobert, who received a grant from the British government and the Order of the British Empire. Her famous cupboard is now an exhibit in the Imperial War Museum. I first met Louis Basquin in the thickest part of the woods which skirt the French village of Bertry. Basquin was a woodcutter. I was a fugitive soldier, cut off from my regiment, the 11th Hussars, at the Battle of Cateau in August 1914. For 4 months I had wandered the country in the Cambrai district with 2 companions. Together we had lived as best we could. A meal here and there from kindly peasants, one night sleeping in a haystack, another in a thicket. Always we were faced with the spectre of capture and the prospect of spending the rest of the war in a prison camp, for the zone in which we were at large was now in the occupation of Germans. Penalties were very severe for those of the Allied armies who failed to give themselves up. Even more severe for those who aided soldiers in escaping or harboured them in their homes. When, on that bitterly cold January forenoon, I emerged from a little clearing, I felt it was a sorry figure, unshaven, unkempt, and half-starved, which came face to face with Louis Basquin as he hewed at an enormous tree trunk. I was alone. My companions and I had separated a few days before, thinking we might have a better chance of breaking through the enemy lines singly than together. The woodcutter could see that I was pretty well all in. The tattered khaki uniform that I was endeavouring to hide under an old civilian coat I had managed to borrow unmistakably marked me as a British soldier. Neither of us could speak the other's language very well, but it did not take me long to realise that Basquin was my friend, prepared to help me elude the common enemy. His first act was to share with me his lunch of bread and cheese. Then he led me to a haystack, signed me to a tunnel into its depths, somehow made me understand that he would return later, and then covered me up. True to his word, he returned after dusk and led me to the village of Bertry, where he lived. No sooner had we entered the village than I saw 2 German military police loom up out of the darkness. They barred our way. Basquin, a well-known local figure, nudged me. I knew I had to hold my tongue. "What are you doing out at this time of night?" questioned one of the policemen. There was a stringent curfew in all occupied territories. "I have been to see my mother-in-law, who is very ill," explained Basquin. Despair filled my heart. Was my liberty, after the months of hardship and anxiety I had endured to avoid capture, to be snatched from me by this chance encounter? Suddenly, revolver shots sounded. There were shouts and the sound of running feet further up the street. The attention of the police was at once diverted, and without further questions, they hurried away to break up a group of German soldiers engaged in a violent quarrel. I felt Basquine's hand on my arm, and in a moment we were both hastening down a dim cobbled alley. It had been a narrow escape. When we arrived at his humble dwelling, he gave me food as generously as his meagre war rations would allow, and set about devising a hiding place where I could remain in comparative safety. "I think it would be better if you stayed at the house of my mother-in-law," Basquine said presently. "Her rooms are larger, and it will make it easier to hide you than in my tiny house." Basquine, who had been pronounced unfit for war service by a French tribunal, was married to the eldest daughter of Mme Belmont-Gobert, who lived a few streets away with her other two daughters, Euphemie, the youngest, and Angèle. Now came the problem as to where I was to be hidden, for it would have to be in a place unlikely to be suspected. All possible hiding places were carefully examined during the periodical house-to-house searches organized by the German military authorities. "Les buffets!" exclaimed Angèle suddenly. All eyes turned to a cupboard that stood of one of the ground-floor rooms. Perhaps it would be more accurate to describe it as a squat wardrobe, for it was less than 6 feet high, with a perpendicular wooden partition dividing it into two sections, one of which was shelved, the other provided with pegs for hanging clothes. Little did I think, on that day in 1915, when I first squeezed into the confined space Mme Belmont-Gobert made by removing her clothes, that this piece of furniture would be my home for almost 4 years. I had been in my hiding place less than a week when it was rumoured that German soldiers were to be billeted in the house. A week later they came, 8 of them. They occupied the upper part of the house, but spent much of their time drinking coffee and gossiping in the room where I was hidden. Can you imagine my feelings as I sat huddled in the darkness of that stifling recess, listening to their laughter, their quarrels, their dubious jokes, their coarse talk with the daughters of the house? One night I must have moved slightly, for the woodwork creaked. To me it sounded like the crack of a pistol. Certainly it was enough to make Madame spring up on her chair by the fireside, and with great presence of mind exclaim to the soldiers sitting round playing cards, "Ah, ces boiteux soirées! Oh, those wretched mice!" And, with quick resourcefulness, I heard her advance and flick round the outside of the wardrobe in mock pursuit of a phantom mouse. There were many who had to be let into the secret of Madame Belmont-Gobert's cupboard. The reason was the matter of food. As the war progressed, the rationing of food increased in severity. The requirements of the Germans in occupation always came first. It was in face of the alarming shortage of food, particularly in a household as impoverished as that of Madame's, that some of her friends had to know of my existence. Many of them contributed eggs, milk, and potatoes to supplement her frugal larder. Sometimes I was so hungry that I stole from my hiding place while the Germans were out and hacked off a few slices of their unpalatable, though sustaining, black bread. I often wonder if they missed it. A wretched little terrier nearly caused my downfall. Day after day he would be brought in by his mistress, a notorious gossiper, and so not in the secret, and I dreaded the moment when his shrill yapping and scratching sounded without. Sometimes the billeted Germans were there at the same time, and I once went so far as to borrow a hatpin from Angèle. Next time the little brute started his sniffings, I jabbed at him through the crevice. I think by the sudden yelp he let out that the pinpoint must have made itself felt, and I heard him scurry away. Mme Belmont-Gobert's resourcefulness again saved the situation that might have developed into a serious one. "Poor Dodo," I heard her say. "He must have put his nose on a nail." At any rate, he never came again. Shortly afterwards, warning notices that the death penalty awaited anyone found harbouring soldiers of the Allied armies after a certain date were posted all over the town. I therefore deemed it too risky for Mme Belmont-Gobert to keep me a moment longer in her house. I pointed out the grave perils that she and her brave daughter were running. "We will find you another hiding place then," said Madame, persuaded at last. So one day, clothed as a peasant woman, and carrying an umbrella with which I shielded my face, I was guided to a barn. I took out some loose palings and hid myself. Shall I ever forget that rat-infested hole, or the month of indescribable horror I spent there? For 4 weeks I never saw the sun. By day I could hear the tramp of patrolling soldiers overhead. At night, Basquin would creep cautiously over the fields to bring me my food. When the scare died down, I returned to my cupboard. On the return journey, with Mme Belmont-Gobert again as my escort, there was a dramatic moment. I inadvertently allowed the shawl to slip from my head. At that moment, a German soldier came staggering past, the worse for drink. He must have been pretty far gone, or he would have seen the beard I had grown. "Hello, my dears. What are you doing at this time of night?" he hiccuped. And once again the quick wit of Mme Belmont-Gobert stood me in good stead. With a knowing flourish, she produced a small bottle of some liqueur. There was a shortage of all ordinary drinks from her corsage, and with a wink of her eye, offered it to the carousing Teuton. As he loosened the stopper and raised the flask to his lips with a convivial gesture, I hastened on my way, keeping my face averted. A moment later, I was joined by Madame. We were saved. It was not the only time I was forced to adopt a woman's disguise. There were rumours of another house-to-house search, and I was at once hurried to a haystack at the back of the house in my dress and my shawl. After some hours hidden under an immense weight of hay, I heard German voices. A large number of bottles of wine, which it was suspected were hidden in the hay, were being searched for. The next thing I knew was that pronged forks were being plunged into my hiding place. But once more, fortune favoured me, and although the forks came perilously near, I escaped unhurt. The months wore on, and then one day the news trickled through that the Germans required the whole of Mme Belmont-Gobert's house for building purposes, and she must leave. She at once set about finding a new dwelling. Eventually, a 2-room cottage some distance away with a loft above was picked. The problem of the removal of my cupboard with the rest of the furniture arose. It was decided that I was to remain in my hiding place. Basquin enlisted the services of a villager to help lift the cumbersome receptacle onto a waiting cart. Even as I felt myself swaying in mid-air, the voice of a passing German, offering to lend a hand, reached me. "No, no," I heard the alarmed voice of Angèle protest. "Leave it to them. They can manage alone." And then I could feel the added aid of the volunteer as I was hoisted aloft and dumped, none too gently, on the vehicle, which shortly afterwards moved off with a rumble of cobbles in my ears and a great deal of jarring of my limbs. The German must have been of great good nature, for when, after a series of lurches, the conveyance suddenly stopped, I could hear him again volunteering to assist with the unloading. It was not until I heard the breezy sallies of his departure that I was able to breathe again. Once my cupboard was inspected. By an amazing premonition, of Mme Belmont-Gobert's, I was not in it. I had been so bold as to leave my hiding place one evening and relax in an armchair in the company of Mme Belmont-Gobert and her daughter. Presently, there came a peremptory knocking at the locked door. I sprang back into the cupboard and pulled the door to, but while Angèle gained time with a great noise of grappling with an obstinate door fastening, Madame signed me with imploring gestures to a place beneath the mattress of a large feather bed in an adjoining room. I was lucky. Never had the house been so thoroughly searched, for even the cupboard was included this time. After they had plunged their bayonets into the mattress beneath which I lay, I think it was wine again rather than me they were looking. Once more I muttered a silent prayer to my guardian angel, as they left me unscathed. I lived in that cupboard for 2 more years, and then, one memorable day in October 1918, came the retreat of the Germans from their advanced lines. The village of Bertry was evacuated, and British troops poured in, Canadian cavalry and the South African Scottish. I was in the street at the time. But the anticlimax of my joy at freedom came when I was challenged as a deserter after all I had suffered. There was grim irony in being arrested and marched between 2 military policemen to the British headquarters. Had it not been for the amazing coincidence that, as I trudged along with my escort, I came face to face with the officer who had commanded the troops of the 11th Hussars, which had been cut off from the main body of the regiment at La Cateau 4 years before, and that he testified to my true identity, I might, even now, not be alive to tell the tale.
Brother Bertry went away to do his bit the other day, with a smile on his lips and his lieutenant mix upon his shoulder, bright and gay. As the train moved out, he said, "Remember me to all the birds," though he wagged his paw and went away to war, shouting out these pathetic words. Goodbye, when the day may begin from your life. Oh, it's hard to part, I know. I'll be tickled to death, I go.